I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Shefali Sanghvi is Director of Sustainability at Dattner Architects, and she is going to present about the Alafia District Plan, about equity, buildings, and climate action. So Shefali, please take it away.
Hi all, thanks for joining us at hour 23 of this super exciting session. I'm going to talk a little about, under this umbrella of closing the circle, talking about equity, resiliency, and future horizons. So my name is Shefali Sanghvi. I'm the Director of Sustainability here at Dattner Architects. Dattner is a New York City-based firm that does a lot of what we call civil architecture. So we have a large housing studio that does a lot of affordable housing, and I'm going to highlight one of the projects that we're working on in that studio here. But we also do a lot of transportation and infrastructure and sort of schools and healthcare and educational work, things that we feel are part of the civic realm. And so one of the things that I've always been really interested about, and one of the reasons that I got into architecture, which if you've heard one of my many podcasts that I've done with Passive House Accelerator, you kind of know, is this idea of affordable housing and how oftentimes affordable housing gets built in these really undesirable locations. You know, these are just sort of generic images of housing that's built often near plants or on a Superfund site. And this is not only an issue that happens across the country when we talk about smaller single-family homes like that image on the top right, but also in New York City, right? In New York City, the stereotype of affordable housing is these large towers and with these kind of underutilized parks and playgrounds around them near treatment plants. And I think this is nothing about intention, right? I mean, I think the intention is always there. There's this acknowledgement that we have to provide affordable housing, but it's kind of, we're forced into these places because the land is cheap there, because they are undesirable. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is how can we use Passive House to address some of these inequities, historical inequities, and how affordable housing often gets cited. And so the project I wanted to talk about today is Alafia. It is this 25-acre master plan project in Brooklyn, New York. And I recognize how fortunate we are to look at a master plan project in New York City. But I also think this idea of a master plan and how we could impact change in a very large-scale way using Passive House principles is something that might resonate with more of you who are on this in this broadcast. So Alafia is this Yoruba word that means peace, health, and well-being. And it's part of the New York State's Vital Brooklyn initiative that is really emphasizing health and wellness in new affordable housing developments in areas that chronically have residents chronically have health conditions. So the entire master plan includes 2,400 units that are 100% affordable, and also community facility uses, retail, a school, a waste treatment plant. And it's built around concepts of blue zones and really emphasizes sort of this 10-minute neighborhood, which you can see on this diagram on the left. So we are not immune from this idea of undesirable sites, right? You can see the site here highlighted in red, and I've kind of circled some of these less desirable things that are around our site. There's a wastewater treatment plant, there's a bus depot, we're around manufacturing districts, and we're also immediately adjacent to a highway. There is a park, but it's on the other side of the highway. So you have to figure out how you're going to cross the highway to get here. And this is true for a lot of affordable housing sites. We get the last sites that are left, and there's a reason these are the last sites that are left. So our context kind of varies, right? We're adjacent to a suburban style shopping center. We have both highly dense, large-scale housing projects as well as low-rise housing projects. And as I mentioned earlier, we are adjacent to a highway. So I think the idea here was, how can we address all of this from a master plan point of view and also from a building point of view? So we developed these zones in this neighborhood that really speak to the context that is surrounding it. For example, the area indicated in Area 1 is the commercial corridor that is immediately adjacent to that suburban style plaza that I mentioned earlier. And Area 5, which is the parking area, is adjacent to the highway to provide kind of like this additional buffer and to clearly delineate where vehicles would stay for those of you who come, for those who are visiting and living this neighborhood. And so the master plan was developed with these, to emphasize these three identities, right, at three scales. The neighborhood identity that gives you a sense of place and connection to the city at large and the immediate context. The community identity that allows people to feel a sense of ownership and pride to these spaces that are created as part of the master plan, such as the parks and some of these things that are often sort of seen as everyone has access to them. And then obviously the personal identity, so that everyone here feels like they have a home and they have this safe, secure place to live. So just gonna, before we get into sort of the passive house stuff, just this idea of like, how can we take this concept of passive house and really emphasizing passive house, which allows us to emphasize on health and wellness, and really talk about how they can be applied at a larger scale. There is this whole idea of site access and connectivity, clearly delineating pedestrian zones and vehicular zones so that it's clear that this is really intended to be a pedestrian-friendly space, that we have created this neighborhood where you don't really need a car to get around. And, honestly, that's true for a lot of New York City, but isn't true for everywhere, isn't true for a lot of neighborhoods across the world. We also looked at solar exposure and views. Not only does it impact the massing of the buildings, but it also impacts the way we integrate open space into both the master plan and the buildings. So we have this large public park in the center. So it's kind of this commons that everyone has equal access to. We're providing a buffer of large scale buildings along the site perimeter, and then smaller scale, less dense housing in the middle, so that we are acknowledging that there is a variety of housing context in the existing area. This also helped inform these green zones. So there's passive spaces, active spaces, and agriculture that really sort of close that loop on this emphasis on health and wellness, that this idea is that we want people to be able to come out of their homes and have a place where they can be, that's appropriate for the wide variety of people that we anticipate living here, whether it's seniors or people with kids, that there's always something to do. And the agriculture part really helps address the fact that this is somewhat of a food desert, that there's not a lot of great healthy food options nearby. And often when we're creating a master plan, we get to say like, oh yes, there will be retail here, but is there a way to allow residents to feel more connected to the way their food is grown, and have more direct access to the food that they eat? So all of this goes and, I think the interest of the people who are watching this show is, how does this relate to the sustainability master plan? And so, I like to consider sustainability very holistically. So it's health and wellness, it's energy consumption, so it's operational carbon, it's embodied carbon, but it's also resiliency. And I think we are adjacent to the water. And one of the things that we did, and this is just a screenshot of the master plan documents that all future buildings have to comply to, is that we raised the entire site as part of the phase 1 work to be above the 500-year floodplain, assuming 2080 sea level rise. And, when we were designing the project, we really looked at using the rubble and existing fill on the site. And you can see on the images on the top left, the existing dormitory buildings that were there, to use that demo material to help raise the site up, trying to really avoid the use of virgin fill and really start thinking about how we can use concepts of circularity into developing this entire site. Was the buildings were deemed hazardous, and so we were not able to completely use all of the buildings to fill the site, but I think the intent was still there. And so the next few images are just kind of renderings of the project, but part of the site being in a floodplain meant that there were many stormwater management measures that needed to be incorporated, including bioswales, and working closely with the landscape architect to ensure that all landscaped worked towards this goal of reducing the surface flow of stormwater. And we also include a number of rain gardens, and all of this works really well with this concept of this plaza and this commons at the center of the project. The Sustainability Master Plan also included provisions for green roofs and solar arrays at the roofs of the buildings. So not only does this comply with local New York City code, but it also helps offset our operational carbon, which is something that we look to quite closely when we talk about passive house projects. The other sources of renewable energy that we have as part of this is geothermal for heating and cooling, and also a biodigester that's included as part of this waste management facility that you see at the bottom of the screen here. The site is very far from existing infrastructure. So part of what we did was try to make it kind of standalone, or have the ability to stand alone, to make a microgrid that serves the buildings and helps further, helps reduce our site EUI for each individual project, and also to have a central place for trash to be, where DSNY, the local Department of Sanitation in New York, can come and pick up the trash, but it also makes sure that we're collecting a variety of waste streams, including organics. And so some of the compost that happens from that happens from the organics waste, then feeds back into the urban farm from the agriculture portion that I spoke about earlier. So here's a picture of the waste. Here's a rendering rather of the waste treatment area and the urban farm that I mentioned earlier. But I think the thing that the place where we have the most potential impact here is mandating that all future buildings are designed and built to passive house standards. I think, this idea of passive house, sometimes we look at passive house and we see that it's really about reducing energy consumption, and all of the things that we do, the building tightness, the attention to detailing and air sealing, all helps reduce infiltration and impacts our energy use. But there's also this entire sort of indoor health component to it, right? We're bringing in tempered, filtered, fresh air into every habitable space, and that really helps address, these high, it really helps to address all of these new quote unquote forms of extreme climate change that we're seeing. And last summer, New York City was blanketed with smoke from Canadian wildfires, which is something that we would have never in a million years thought would be something that we would have to deal with. And we found that our passive house buildings did, by and large, pretty well. Tenants did not really complain about smoke coming into their apartments. They didn't have to worry about particulates. And I live in New York City. And during that time, even though all of our windows were shut, there was a lot of dust in our apartment. So I think this idea that, yes, we want to reduce our energy consumption, but there is a big health and wellness benefit to this. It also helps filter out noise for many of these sites that are built adjacent to a highway or built in very loud manufacturing areas. And, we have to start thinking about passive house as this all-encompassing building performance standard. That yes, energy consumption and reducing energy consumption is a big part of that, but there is also this big tenant health component to it, and it really helps address a lot of the chronic health conditions that unfortunately residents who live in affordable housing often have to deal with because of the existing site context and not necessarily because of the projects themselves. So phase one is under construction right now. It includes 3 buildings and a lot of the infrastructure, the roadway work, a lot of that stormwater work that I was speaking about earlier. And the interesting thing about this one that I think might be compelling to some of the people who are listening to this is that this project, the larger scale building in the background, even though it's 2 buildings, it's going to be tested for the blower door test as one volume and will be the largest blower door test by volume in North America when it is tested, which I thought was really fascinating. So I hope you guys also find that really interesting. And it's going to be designed to fee standards. It's already fee pre-certified. And I think that's also really interesting because many of the projects that we talk about in New York City are designed to fee standards, which is more forgiving to the temperate zone of New York City. And that's kind of it. I really hope that if you take anything away from this, it's this idea that we can apply passive house principles to not only individual building solutions, but large scale solutions, and therefore have a bigger impact to not only the communities in which we build, but to the world at large. That QR code on the top right is my business card. So if you have additional questions, if you want to learn more about the project, or if you just want to talk more about Passive House, please feel free to reach out. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this fantastic conference. Thanks.